Part 5 of this series of Climate 101 will be the last part, and then you're off to the races with the rest of your training series. So bon voyage after this. But I wanted to take a moment and in some ways kind of look back on the first 4 videos I gave you. Kind of how did you feel after some of those videos? I laid a lot on you. And there were some scary graphs, some scary numbers. My voice got low at times to emphasize a point. There was a lot to feel down about. And so my question for this final part of the series is this an effective way to talk about climate change? If so, in what context? If not, why not? So we're going to kind of dig into your own psychology, or at least my own psychology for a little bit, fair warning. And I'll use this as an example. At some point in one of the videos, I showed you this graph, actually an earlier version of it, showing that Americans were, responsible for 5 planets worth of resources. If everyone on the planet lived like us, we would need 5 Earths just to sustain us. And there's a lot of emotions you could take from this. It's a call to action. It's a sense of urgency. So what do you do with those emotions about climate change after I've presented you with this? Do you take fervent action? Do you immediately run to your workplace and put up a recycling bin and run around and turn off all the lights that your coworkers left on for no apparent reason? Are you an evangelist about it? Do you call people out whenever you see them, throwing a tin can in the landfill bin or driving their car when they don't need to? Are you in denial about it? Do you make excuses for why you need to drive your car to work that day, or why you need to have an inefficient stove or something like that? Or are you apathetic? Do you simply turn away from it, knowing that either it's not a big deal, or other people are already taking care of it, or your life is already too busy to make it your own problem? And the reality is, probably all of us occupy all 4 of these states simultaneously all the time. We all feel a little bit of fervent action. We all feel a little bit evangelical, but also in self-defense, we also need to deny or be apathetic about things just to maintain the rest of our lives and to not focus on the urgency and the crisis all the time. Which brings us to the question of guilt and shame, which inevitably somewhere in this video series you probably felt a little bit of, unless you're totally self-actualized, in which case, good for you. And just to clarify, guilt is something other people put on you, people guilt you. Shame is something you feel about yourself, kind of a self-guilt. When we feel guilty about something, when we feel guilty that I'm responsible for 5 Earths, or I drove my car today and I didn't have to, and I contributed to climate change, or I'm a consumptive American, whatever. There is a bone in our body, maybe several bones in our bodies, that will tend to be defensive. We will look away from the actual issue that we have been asked to face, and we'll make it about ourselves. If I came at you and said, we only have 6 or 7 years to finish using fossil fuels, you might come back and say, well, I try to drive as little as I can, but they don't give me any options, or like I have to fly for work or something. You might get defensive. You might make it about yourself, which is a totally natural human thing to do. And this is just a result of unresolved feelings or cognitive dissonance about climate change. It's knowing that you need to do something, but also feeling like you can't, and not being able to resolve those 2 things in your brain. And the result of this is this defensiveness, or what I would call eco-fragility. If you're aware of the term white fragility, which is the defensiveness that white people feel when they're confronted with issues of race, they tend to make it about themselves and to make excuses rather than just accepting, the history of racial oppression in this country and seeking to learn more and do something about it. They get defensive, and that's called white fragility, if I'm explaining that correctly. Eco-fragility is much the same thing. When confronted with an environmental issue like climate change, rather than just focusing on the issue and saying, okay, I've learned something new, here's something I can change, or here's something I can work on, we might get defensive and make it about ourselves. Add all this up, that defensiveness, that need to feel comfortable in the face of all this guilt or shame, means we're going to seek out affirmation and attention from other people who feel the same way. What's called confirmation bias. And if you're familiar with medical research, you're very familiar with the idea of confirmation bias and how to avoid it. But we're going to seek out people who affirm our defensiveness and therefore will feel better about ourselves. The net result of all of this is that you may be even less likely to work on climate change. I've given you a piece of information that I hoped would spur you to act on climate change and to, pull your socks up and get out there. But the result might be that you actually are less likely to act on climate change because of that, very innate, very human feeling of defensiveness and that seeking out of confirmation or affirmation. You will also feel, to some degree, some kind of grief. You could call this eco-grief, you could call this solastalgia. There's lots of different terms or words for it. But in some way, at some point, you will be in denial about the crisis of climate change, or you will feel angry about it, or you will try to reason through it, bargaining, or you just feel sad about it and depressed, or you'll feel accepting of it. In reality, this isn't a linear progression through these things. It's not even a cycle. It's more like a ping pong ball. And the more you are engaged with climate change, the more you will feel these, the more acutely you will feel these stages or feelings of grief. I teach climate change. I think about this, talk about this, study this all day, every day, year after year. And I feel these acutely, and I sit in all 5 of them all the time. Right now, in this moment, I'm feeling a little bit of denial, feeling angry, I'm bargaining, I'm depressed, I'm also accepting. These all exist in my head. No one of them is taking over. And thankfully, I have a lot of practice in recognizing these and setting them aside to focus on the bigger issue. But you will feel some of this, along with the guilt or shame or defensiveness. You will feel a little bit of grief at having lost something. The reality is the world you grew up in will be different by the time your kids or grandkids grow up in it. Or it's already changed. Or if you don't have kids, the next generation that you care about will grow up in a world that's very different from the one you knew. And we are grieving a loss of an environment that will never exist again. So the question is, and I hope I've already answered this, or you've already answered this yourself, but will better information save us? If I show you better graphs, more graphics, more, statistics, something, will that change your mind? Or if you did that to a family member or a friend, would that change their mind? And I see these things all the time. You see on signs that people carry in protests or in speeches that people give about climate change. They say, get behind the science. You see this in COVID as well, get behind the science. Or I hear, largely from students who come and say, hey, how do I convince, my uncle that climate change is real? And the reality is that message doesn't really get through to people. If people are already experiencing that grief or that depression or that shame or excuse-making defensiveness, telling them to get behind the science isn't a message they're going to receive. Trying to convince them isn't something that's necessarily going to be effective. It's not to say you can't convince somebody in the right circumstances with the right person. If you are the right messenger, you can convince people. But largely that's not going to be an effective strategy. And when you do give people information like I have done to you, there's a whole series of barriers that your brain puts up out of self-defense, because I am giving you a crisis. I'm giving you some really bad, what. And so just for your own self-preservation, for your own mental health, for your own happiness, your brain does put up barriers, whether you're trying to or not. This is very well articulated by this psychologist from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And he describes these 5 barriers. Distance, if I present you with climate information, it's easy to look at climate change and say, that's a few decades off, or these impacts are not going to affect me, they're going to affect people in Bangladesh or Vietnam, as I've described already in this video series. So it's easy to separate yourself from it, both temporally and geographically. The next barrier is that it's a doom message. I've given you so much doom. I'm sorry, but thank you for bearing with me. And our brains just don't respond to doom. We turn away from it. It's too much for us to handle. And so what we're left with is dissonance, which is this inability to reconcile what we know and what our actions are. You know, I drove my car today. I didn't actually. I drove it yesterday. I didn't need to. And I know that I shouldn't have because greenhouse gas emissions, but I did it anyway. So I'm going to have this dissonance and I'm going to make up excuses for why I needed to do it. And that's just going to sit in my brain, is this kind of unresolved feeling. Denial, which we'll talk about, that's sort of an extension of dissonance. It's that, you know, ability to live with that dissonance. And then identity is a huge one, which I imagine has become clearer and clearer to most people in the US in the past 5 years, just how much political identity or cultural identity or regional identity drives you to focus on an issue or to ignore an issue, or to take a side on an issue that you might not have taken a side on if you'd simply been, you know, educated elsewhere or raised in a different place, or who knows. But identity plays a huge role in whether someone's even willing to receive a climate message. So to focus in on denial a little bit, and I'm doing this because I think it's very personal for me and for you probably, and because climate deniers, quote unquote, are the target, or at least the focus of a lot of climate discussions. So denial, the definition of denial is the capacity to live as if you don't know what you know. And all of us do this all the time. We all know something that we pretend we don't know. Maybe you haven't cleaned your kitchen counter in a week, but you still ate something off of it today because you just pretended that you didn't know that it was probably dirty. Probably shouldn't eat off of it. Anything from big things like climate change or racism, all the way down to small things like whether you should eat it off your counter. This can appear from the outside as a lack of information, that someone's simply ignorant of the facts, and if only they knew, then they would change their mind and suddenly become, you know, the staunchest climate activist. It appears that way, but rarely is denial a result of a lack of information. Instead, it's usually a result of the things that I just described: grief, climate grief, their identity, that, you know, maybe they align with a political party or religious identity or something that assumes climate change is impossible or that it's a hoax. They have this cognitive dissonance going on, and all the fatigue that comes from that, and the guilt, and they're afraid of what climate change might mean if it is real. And all of this is extremely tiring to carry around with you all the time. And so in that moment where you're feeling grief and guilt and fear and fatigue and dissonance, that's a dark place to sit in, and you have a choice in that moment. And depending on your frame of mind at that time, the community you're a part of, you know, who knows, you could go one of two ways. You could pull up your socks and face a very harsh, very difficult reality, but at least face it head on. Or you can turn away from it and pretend it doesn't exist. And this is where denial comes in. So again, all of us have denial of some kind. In fact, all of us have denial about climate change at any given moment, just because we need to not focus on it all the time. If we really thought about how big of a crisis climate change is, we would never be able to turn away from it. So at some point, just to live our lives, we do have to turn away and ignore it for a moment. So we all feel this at all times. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts to kind of wrap up, you know, especially this section of the series, but kind of all 5 of these videos. The first thing is that you are not guilty. I'm not just saying this to make you feel better. I'm saying this because it's true. Guilt is something that is very much a direct result of your choice. And none of us chose climate change. We are all facing it. We're all learning about it as it happens. So carrying around guilt about it isn't productive. It doesn't get us anywhere. And making other people feel guilty also doesn't get us anywhere. Along the same token, along the same lines, convincing is largely futile. You know, in the right circumstances, if someone's very much open to reason and new information, yes, you can convince them about climate change. But if you are facing someone who's in that, kind of dark state of denial, throwing more information at them in an attempt to convince them is not going to work. In fact, you'll probably make the problem worse. So choose your conversations wisely. Often, rather than convincing, simply asking questions can be hugely productive. Even if they don't get anywhere new with that, they at least open up to questions more than they open up to being bombarded with information. This is why in-person teaching is a lot more effective than online teaching, but for the logistics of this class, I'm glad I'm able to at least be here with you in this form. Belief versus understanding. This is just my own little pet peeve. A lot of people say, I believe in climate change, or I don't believe in climate change, or they ask, do you believe in climate change? Please don't do that. Just say whether you understand climate change or don't understand climate change, and ask people, do you understand climate change? Because that at least gives them the chance to ask a question if they have it. Belief, climate change isn't a religion. Save belief questions for issues of faith. This other one, everyone is struggling. I know that sounds a little cliche, but it's true. If someone is in denial, or if someone's trying to ignore climate change, that's a real struggle. Imagine living in this world and trying to pretend that you don't hear all the climate news, or that you don't notice all the climate effects going on. That's some mental gymnastics. So they are probably struggling with some pretty extreme dissonance, and a little compassion can go a long way. Or if you are facing climate change, the struggle is very acute, and you are feeling the grief and the shame and the guilt and all the things we've talked about. And again, a lot of compassion can go a long way. And this last one, everyone has agency. We all have a choice. You have a choice you can make in every moment on whether to do your work or live your life in the context of climate change, knowing what you know. And everyone around you also has a choice, and they can be held accountable for that choice. Not in a dark way, but they have that choice, and as they're making it, they might be open to a conversation. When I introduce climate change to a lot of groups, if I'm just a guest for a day, for example, I like to give people this paradox, what I'm calling the climate paradox, which is that we have to do something about climate change. That's the right side of that circle. But it's so hard to do. I've given you some drawdown solutions, I've given you some wedges, but it's a lot. It's a lot to do. And given the political will in this country, it doesn't feel like we're actually going to get it done. And so it feels like we can't solve climate change, but we absolutely have to. We don't have a choice there, but we can't. And so we're kind of stuck in this loop. All of us are kind of going round and round and round thinking we have to, but we can't, but we have to, but we can't. The only way to break out of this paradox is to choose a side. And I know that's not how you normally actually break out of a paradox. That's the point of a paradox. But it's a false paradox, because in the end, we can do something about climate change. Not to pull an Obama on you, but we can do it. And so we have to come down on the right side of this paradox and say we have to, so we will. And that's the only way to get out of this. So what does that mean for you? Obviously, you're going to continue with this training series, and you have a profession, you have a life that may give you some opportunities to address climate change directly. But what everyone can do and keep in mind all the time, which isn't too much of a burden, is that there's always an immediate next step. It doesn't have to be something big. It can be something really small. It can be something as simple as sorting the trash from the recycling, or turning the lights off, or choosing not to drive to work one day. And those immediate next steps, however small they are, have a really high chance of leading to something else. Maybe you don't drive to work tomorrow and you realize how easy it is, and so you don't drive the next day. And maybe that means once or twice a week, you take a chance to not drive and you get on your bike, or you take a bus, or you carpool, or something, whatever is possible for you. Or maybe you don't eat meat for dinner tonight, and you only eat meat some of the other days of the week. And you realize how easy it is to do that. Those actions lead to further things, and those become bigger. And maybe the most important thing is to have a community around you that affirms that those actions on climate change, and that conversation, and people you can talk to about it. The statistics around the number of people in this country that talk about climate change at least once a year are really alarming. There's a pretty large majority of the country, at least if I'm remembering the numbers right, that don't talk about climate change more than once a year, if at all. So having a community around you that is at least willing to just talk about it, even in passing, even offhandedly, can be so powerful, because talking about it leads to action, action leads to bigger action. And then who knows where you go from there. You are all in very unique positions. You all have a unique skill set and set of passions, and there are certain needs around you based on where you are. And so there's a lot of potential out there. There's a lot of opportunity, and I wish you all the best with it. So good luck. Thank you for watching these videos, and I wish you all the best with the rest of the course.